On this edition,
what do you do with a War Department full of warfighters when your public doesn't want a war?
And does that mean governments would rather weaponise your brand in the war for attention?
From Phonogram and the Attention Practice, this is the podcast all about the attention economy. Welcome to Can We Have Your Attention?
Hello, Claire.
Hello, James.
Lovely to be here again to talk all things about weaponisation. Aren't we fun here on this podcast?
We are the most fun podcast about weaponization.
That's true. We are the most fun podcast.
We're the nicest, certainly.
Certainly. Well, look, for anyone just joining us, my name's James Wickham. I am a journalist and a broadcaster and various other bits and pieces as well. And I'm really here just to be the kind of wingman to Claire Coady, who's the founder of the Attention Practice. And I'm just clever and intelligent and all of those things. So that's good, isn't it? So, Claire, why don't you tell us what this particular episode is all about? And obviously it's about weaponization, but what does that mean?
So this is specifically about brands being weaponized in the war for attention. And what we mean by that specifically is that brands are being used by lots of different people, but particularly I think politicians and some governments, let's say, to send signals to people to help them in whatever kind of war they're fighting, whether it's a war for attention in an election year, whether it's a culture war they're setting out to fight or to frame for people, or whether it's just to boost their own brands.
And so we've seen quite a lot of evidence of this recently, haven't we? Especially in the States with the Trump administration. So shall we get into some examples, really, of what you've seen and what you've noted? Because you've got a whole Substack post about this, which I suggest people read in conjunction with this podcast.
Yes.
Which we'll put in the show notes as well.
But we'll take you through what the argument that's set out in that piece here, I think. Because, let's face it, reading is boring. No, I'm joking. Reading is great. Please read the piece.
We're actually only going to do comics from now on. That's the new thing, right? Everything on this podcast is just going to be illustrated.
I did draw a little chart the other day. I think you saw that it was the stick figures for the scroll, scream, and stop.
That's good. Can you draw? Are you an arty person?
No. I mean, it's a gigantic joke that I'm one of the doodlers who just draw boxes, not boxes, cubes. Boxes. My notebook's just full of cubes.
I do.
Yeah.
I do cubes.
You do cubes too?
Yeah, must be something about being a journalist or an analytical mind. You just do cubes.
Oh, yeah, because now I'm a journalist, so it's an analytical thing.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. Anyway, right, tell us a bit about, then, especially what's happening in the States at the moment, because I think that's the use case we should really focus on at this point.
It's definitely the use case. So I think it's worth setting up. This isn't just limited to the United States. It's happening all over the world, but I think the United States is where it is, let's say, the strongest and probably the most dangerous for your brand. So we'll go back to how this train of thought started. And it was when Andrew Cheatham, lovely Andrew Cheatham, security correspondent for Can We Have Your Attention, appeared on this podcast a few weeks ago to talk about...
have you given him a new official title?
I have.
I like it. It's excellent. Catherine Templer-Lewis is our neuroscience correspondent. If you want to listen to that episode, excellent. No, carry on. Sorry.
So security correspondent Andrew Cheatham, when he joined us in the podcast to talk about Iran, to talk about also disruptive technologies and AI being used in defense. And we had that conversation with him, you might remember, where we talked about the Anthropic dilemma, right? What was happening with Anthropic and the Pentagon in that battle where Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump announced that Anthropic would be added to a list of banned suppliers, basically. And Andrew described that tension between Anthropic and its CEO, Dario Amodei, and Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense / Secretary of War, however you want to frame that, and also Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, as a vibes-based issue.
A lot of this is about optics, is about vibes. Anthropic is seen as the woke LLM. I think of all of the other AI models, Grok is certainly the far right favorite. But there's definitely a bit of that sort of inescapable politics behind this that may not speak to the substance of the issues.
It made me think about the importance of the brands there. I mean, he said very clearly there wasn't love lost between these people as individuals, but actually there was something about the brands themselves. And what's become apparent is that Anthropic actually has built very strong brand around ethical AI and AI safety, right, as a key positioning. Now, its reason for doing that is that it is trying to make headway into enterprise-grade AI. So enterprise-grade AI being the walled garden AI that corporations use for their own systems. And the reason you want a supplier that is really concerned with ethics and safety is because that says they're not going to break your business with something loose cannon going out, with something that's barely tested or, isn't taking into account the fact that there needs to be regulatory oversight, for example. OpenAI is a little bit faster, looser with the product. So, that as a brand positioning made sense. However, this is useful if you are the Pentagon and you have a Secretary of Defense/War who made a speech in the rebranding of that department announcing that the war was against their ways of doing business. And the way that they framed that, or the way that Pete Hegseth specifically framed it in that speech, was that it was fighting tepid legality with maximum lethality.
It's a hell of a phrase, isn't it? Let's give them that.
Violent effect, not politically correct. Now, what is more tepidly legal than ethics and safety? And all of this was also, embedded together with the idea that they're fighting woke culture. That was all linked together.
Before we go any further,
yeah,
let's just take a step back. Why did they rename it the Department of War? Or not rename it, but kind of take it back to a previous name?
Now, originally, the rebrand from the Department of War to the Department of Defense in the late 1940s was because the department wanted to signal to the American people, primarily, but also to overseas, to allies, that it was not interested in fighting wars. Because the war was very unpopular in the U.S., particularly after the Second World War, extremely unpopular. In fact, going into the Second World War, I don't think this is something we really talk about, but it was extremely controversial in the U.S. to the U.S. public. They did not want to get involved in the war in Europe. So the shift to the Department of Defense was meant to be that signal that they were going to do everything they can to avoid fighting a foreign war. Now, you can change the name of organizations, but you don't necessarily change its culture. Even 60 years down the line, 70 years down the line, this does not sit comfortably with a number of people inside the Department of Defense, right? Culturally, it is built for war. And after September 11th, there was a shift to the sense that they needed more war fighting spirit. So they actually started referring internally in some documents, some members of the military hierarchy started referring to soldiers as war fighters in an attempt to galvanize people around this cause.
That's an amazing thing. And I didn't know that at all. But, that use of language as a weapon by itself to change the culture within the organization.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a sense that worked, that people did change the way that they thought about the role that department should be doing? I mean, as you said, there were people already there who thought it should be warlike.
Yes. So that initial change after September 11th was more, I think, directing energy, right? Because it's very controversial, right? Calling soldiers war fighters. It changes the nature of what it is that you're doing, right? But some people do find it easier to think that way because it gives them a greater sense of purpose and action. And there is a bias for action in militaries and in defense organizations. It's one of those things where structurally they have to plan for it as well because, you have a culture that's built around taking orders and taking orders to go do something, right? To have an effect. And what's more effective than being pointed at action?
And then you also add in the fact that this is the most WWE style presidency that we've had at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is big bulging muscles, macho. I mean, it's a bit like a Wham video, but anyway, it's the optics are everything.
That change was really about sending a signal to the American public about what this is because, and I think this is crucial, we are in a midterms year. This is midterms. Midterms are heavily fought years. And Make America Great Again was about fundamentally making America stronger. Now, I think in the UK, and definitely in the US as well, originally that message was about economic strength, economic security. But one of the interesting things that's overlooked sometimes is that actually, for most Republican voters, the number one thing they want to be strong is the military. It is more important to people, to Republican voters, that the U.S. is number one militarily. So 92% of Republican voters say that it's important that the U.S. is the number one military in the world, compared to 73% of Republican voters who say they want it to be the number one economy in the world. And 81% of Republican voters believe that the U.S. is the number one military in the world, compared to 49% of Republican voters who believe that it's the number one economy in the world. So if you're the Trump administration and you're looking at those numbers and your whole thing is about getting the base to go out and vote in a midterms year, or at any point, right, because this is now perpetual campaigning, and you're then looking at Supreme Court decisions or other decisions, or, you know, the tone coming out of business, coming out of Wall Street in particular, pushing on the tariffs, it becomes apparent that you can't really change anything economically. You look at the military again. And another crucial number is that although all these Republican voters and most independents as well believe that the U.S. is number one militarily, they think it's quite strong, 34% believe that it's not strong enough. So this becomes a very easy win politically, right? Because you already have people who think it's very strong. They clearly think that something is hampering it, and they want it to be stronger. So you have a pretty easy win on the surface anyway, if you do what's basically a rebranding exercise. Now, in one case, you have a very straightforward rebranding exercise of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. But if you look at the speech they gave alongside that, you can see there's another aspect to that as well. It was really clear. They're trying to square this thing off where fighting foreign wars is very unpopular with the U.S. public. The war that they were fighting and the war that they set out in that speech was not a war with overseas adversaries at all. The war was entirely cast as internal adversaries and really about business as usual with the Pentagon.
There's almost a McCarthyism to this, isn't there? Like, you know, the fighting of internal enemies and so on. I mean, is that how people see it, as a fight against, in this case, the libs?
I'm not sure about the general public, but certainly that's the way that Pete Hegseth branded it. And what I would say is that, you know, the Trump administration they have a good feel for their base. They also do have good research. My numbers that I've used for this have come from Gallup. Gallup does the survey every year, and they ask the same questions every year and have done for 20 years. The data for the most recent one was released on March 5th, 2026, and conducted in the last week of February. Those numbers hadn't significantly changed from the previous year, other than to say that, you know, as with, I guess, normal with the Republican presidency, it went back up with Trump and then goes back down with the Democrat and then goes back up again. But yeah, this does have the smack of McCarthyism, but I think only because they've worked out that this is the easiest win from a political standpoint.
Then let's talk about a bit about some of the brands that they work with or indeed don't work with. You've already mentioned the AI companies, and that's where a lot of the news stories have been about recently, about whether or not they work with Anthropic or whoever.
And I think it's interesting that they went after Anthropic, but not after Palantir, for example. So Anthropic is coming into that contract through Palantir. So what happens with the Department of Defense? The individual companies are names we often we wouldn't hear as household names, right? So they're defense contractors. Defense contractors are granted access to what are called contracting vehicles, right? So those contracting vehicles are multi-year potential contracts that have a ceiling on either the amount of time they are available for or the amount of money, and they expire when the earliest of those two is hit, right? So that's generally how these things work. And into those contracting vehicles for specific services are built a main contractor. So Palantir is that contractor for this particular issue. And then underneath that, they'll have subcontractors working into Palantir. So Anthropic is one of the subcontractors. So within all these contracting vehicles are some household names that you might know, like Amazon or Microsoft or Anthropic. Others are names you won't know at all. And I think that's where the big problem is going to arise, because these companies are not used to having public exposure at all, right? But they are the status quo. They are business as usual. If you're fighting, you know, the way business has been done at the Pentagon, all these contractors are up for dispute, and they're all part of something that is, attached to wild conspiracy theories of the American imagination.
So is this partly then down to the government, in this case, the US administration, wanting to show, in a kind of show of strength, the extent to which it will go to break the norms, and therefore kind of saying to companies, you need to be able to work with us to do exactly what we say without having any sort of legal or ethical, moral background to your decisions? This is, it's a very much a one-way argument here.
I mean, there's a lot to dispute in this. I think what will have taken Anthropic by surprise, it certainly took me by surprise, was what Anthropic was arguing for is what the U.S. government, the U.S. military, will have always asked for their contractors to do, because they were adhering to the law. And certainly also proactively thinking about regulation that wasn't yet established but should be coming. What they were suggesting, at no other point in time, it would have been demanded from suppliers. It was so, it would have taken them by surprise, I'm sure, because to them that asking for ethics and safety, or what they, termed as ethics and safety, was actually just, to me, like bare minimum responsibility that the US government would normally put in place with its contractors.
So is there a reputational risk for these companies in working with the Pentagon, and indeed in not working with the Pentagon?
Yeah, so there's different considerations here, and I should also stress this is different to working with, say, the UK MOD or any other, Western military. The biggest thing being that the Pentagon buys at such a large scale that it's worth investing in things like, a contact was telling me that it was worth investing in prototypes, for example, because you knew the US military would buy at the scale where it would pay back the development of a prototype that might have cost multi-million-dollar builds, right? One of the things we were actually talking about was how you build a tank.
Right.
Like building prototype tanks.
Okay. Yeah.
Or actually, should they even be building a tank? Who knows? Because that's not how war might be fought in the future. Anyway, there's different shades of this, right? So if you're a defense contractor, if you're Booz Allen Hamilton, if you're Northrop Grumman, if you're Lockheed Martin, you're known for that. That's the hit you take. You're already very well aware of the reputational, let's say, risk attached to being a brand that is primarily a defense contractor. And then I think there's a category of very large enterprise brands that they're strong enough and big enough where the hit isn't the same, because there's a lot of reasons why people have them, and once you're big enough and people kind of like you enough for other things, it sort of doesn't matter. Amazon is the one that springs to mind here, but so is Microsoft. Basically every tech company has a contract with the US government and with the Pentagon specifically, because they're a gigantic buyer of technology. Fine. But then you have a bunch of other suppliers and brands, and this is where it gets difficult, which maybe aren't as well known or emerging or do different things. And that's where it becomes grayer. So, if you're, say you're an automotive company, right? You might keep that quieter.
I think the interesting thing in this particular case, and one of the reasons that it became such a big topic, was because it was all about AI. And to focus in a bit on AI at the moment, because we, as you know, we've mentioned Anthropic, we've mentioned ChatGPT and things like that. Do you feel that the administration has overplayed its hand a bit here? Because people generally actually, there was a great piece in the FT the other day about whether or not AI has got the right advertising model at the moment. AI could be an amazing thing to transform the way that we all live and work. And yet people seem to be a bit terrified of it, understandably, because they think it's going to take their jobs. Do you think for Anthropic and for other AI-related companies, the way that the administration has played this actually might play into their hands a bit more?
I think the evidence so far is that it has. So there were a couple of things that sprung out. So one is that taking such drastic action against a tech company, action that has never before been taken against a United States-based company, for reasons to do with public safety, immediately threw up a legal question. Is this possible? So that's one. Two is the effect then it had on Silicon Valley and on the technology industry, which is a massive, massive industry in the US and globally, right? I don't think they foresaw, but the blowback as well, probably more to OpenAI, but the surge in interest it had from consumers, because it almost proved the thing they've been trying to prove in their advertising as well anyway, And through years and years of, statements from the company, the way that they develop their models, the whole thing is built around ethics and safety. In one swoop, Pete Hegseth demonstrated, he effectively offered a set of credentials to Anthropic to prove that they're so concerned with safety.
Yeah.
And that really speaks to consumers who are really afraid of AI. It's getting to the stage now where I think it's not that you can't avoid using AI, but it's becoming much more common to use even lightly, like even say once a week, or it'll be used in a family context soon. Like,
yeah, I mean, even people, wanting to record meetings now. I mean, I was talking to my dad the other day and he was amazed that I could just press record and suddenly have a full meeting and summary delivered within a matter of seconds afterwards. This is all about, isn't it, what the brands themselves are trying to achieve and what they're trying to do and what their core value is. And do you think that one of these will win out over the other as a result of that?
So I think the message that I was thinking about in my piece specifically is that having a strong brand is an asset. Having a strong brand, though, being a known brand, can also be a vulnerability. So in this case, it's a bit of both, right? Because the brand is so strong, because and it's strong because Anthropic has been very consistent in its messaging. Everything it's done has been about safety and ethics, safety and ethics, safety and ethics, reinforced over years, right? In every channel, in their product, in the way it's developed. That consistency of message is what made the brand strong, but it also is what made it vulnerable to be misused by the Pentagon. However, because it's strong, it's been able to kind of bounce back. What the Pentagon did ended up serving Anthropic in a way. Now, like, this is an existential threat to that business. So we shouldn't underplay that. But it sets up, how quickly people were to accept those credentials and go towards it. So just reinforced how important it is to have a strong brand and what that strength can convey. The thing I was thinking a lot about as I was writing it was the strong brand might be something you don't necessarily know as a business that you have, right? There are other strong brands. The Palantir is a very strong brand, but it's also, its strength is in being exactly what the Pentagon and what the Department of War wants to be, right? Maximum lethality, violent effect. Yeah.
That's actually going to be the new slogan for our podcast, if you noticed.
All of the Ivy League institutions at the same time as Anthropic also had ties cut with the Pentagon. And this is also in the news. And the Pentagon diverted the money they would normally spend on education to things like Liberty University, which is a Christian university, private Christian university in the United States. Doesn't have the same educational or reputational cachet as the Ivy League. But in announcing it, they didn't say the Ivy League. They said Harvard. They chose the strongest university brand in that category, right? Not even the one most known for being like ultra woke. I would have said Brown or Dartmouth, right?
Yeah.
But they chose Harvard because Harvard is the strongest brand. And one of the things that I was thinking about was, all of these businesses, all these organizations went through, something I've called the tick box on a tightrope process, where fulfilling these contracts with the Pentagon, you have to do a number of things that are really challenging. You have to have headquarters in certain locations. You have to have staff who have top secret clearances, which are hard to get, and also restricts who you can hire. You can't hire foreign nationals, for example, for certain roles. And how you distribute information. You have to go through really significant processes to show that you're fit and proper to follow these contracts. And then once you do all that, you have to show that you're aligned ethically, values-wise, morally. And in the past, including under the first Trump administration, including under George W. Bush, you would have had to demonstrate commitments to American values and morals that were more about like impartiality, not doing the wrong thing, making sure you're not harming U.S. citizens. There's a lot of things you had to do. And then comes this. Comes Trump too. And into that, I think the way most of these contractors would have looked at it, at least, anecdotally, I've heard this, is they've gone, right, okay, let's cut the DEI programs. right? Let's make sure we're not like celebrating Women's Day too loudly. But that's not going to save you. I think what Anthropic has shown, what Harvard has shown, who did go to efforts to try to find a balance between these things, but had their own red lines. And the red lines, I think, were things they wouldn't have ever expected to have to comply with, right? For Harvard, it was the freedom of expression, which is a fundamental constitutional right in the United States. It is the number one right. It is, Article 1 and the Bill of Rights. For Anthropic, a commitment to safety and not doing harm. That's not something that should be particularly woke, but apparently is, because it's not lethal.
And of course, all of this, actually, to bring it back to the start, kind of shows us that, as you've put, brand United States is in total flux at the moment. So
it's in flux, yeah.
Yeah, so nobody knows what it means, what the United States is, what it's trying to do, whether indeed it will change post midterms, post the next election. So it's really interesting if you're trying to deal with that as a company dealing with the government. There's so many different barriers and so many different things to consider.
Yeah, and I think especially, the number one thing that's been dismantled is the U.S. was consistent. You could rely on it. Even if you disagreed with the United States, even if you disagreed with its foreign policy decisions, even if you disagreed with, say, some of the things it said in the press or some of its statements, generally, it's a reliable actor. Speaking to someone else a few months ago, and they were saying one of the things going through, the brains of people sitting on boards of financial institutions is, actually, if we can't rely on the U.S. Treasury to backstop things, can we rely on anything? Can we rely on anything in this world? Because that immediately affects, the UK. I think over the last 6 weeks or 7 weeks, one of the things that's been called into question is the United States reliable for information? Is it reliable to even know, what the administration itself is thinking, what their actions will do? And how can you plan your business? How can you plan your next quarter, let alone your next year, your next financial year, if you can't determine whether you're going to be weaponized, your brand will be weaponized if they have a bad week in the polls?
All I can suggest at that point is that you employ somebody who's got, say, more than 20 years of experience advising governments, global businesses, marketing, brands, communications. If only
James.
If only we could find somebody like that.
Yeah, if only.
That would be really helpful. If only.
I mean, there are things, I should also say that there are things that brands can do. I mean, the first thing I think is if you have a consumer division, you're generally better off here anyway, right? Like you have a way of tapping into that. If you don't, there are ways of finding that out, right? So I think the first thing that any business, particularly a business that has a contract with the US government should be doing is thinking about, right, this is something that could happen to my business, to my brand. What do people think of us when they think of our brand or business right now? When they hear it, what do they think? Because that's going to determine everything. So undertaking an exercise to understand that. And you don't need to necessarily conduct new research to do that. It might be just having stakeholder interviews with the right people in your organization. The other is figuring out what your position is. Like how much at risk are you, bearing in mind that a U.S. government contract is a really significant undertaking. It does take a lot of effort from your teams. What's the risk and what's the exposure there? And what else would be the fallout from that potentially? Are there consumer brand or consumer aspects of it that would be targeted? But just trying to plan for the future a little bit and then understand what your move would be next. I think Anthropic had I think their response, aside from the reaction when they did, I think was pretty much pitch perfect, right? They let that do the talking. They didn't say anything more than what they needed to, and they just reinforced those commitments to ethics and safety. Knowing what your red lines are, knowing what those values are, and holding and having confidence in them is everything. But if you can't articulate what those are, then you're probably at a loss.
Claire, as always, I am amazed by your intelligence and breadth on war, defense, branding, adverts, and Burger King. Just everything, really. So thank you very much.
It's the joy of being a strategist.
Absolutely. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. If people want to email us about this episode, they can, and they email us at
hello@canwehaveyyourattention.com.
Thank you. Please get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you, anything that we raise in this, or indeed a topic that you would like us to cover. Claire, a pleasure. Thank you very much.
A pleasure as always. Thank you, James.